Good evening all and welcome. Yes, we do have an appointment in the abandoned factory, but before we jump in, don't forget there's a promotion going over on my Patreon where I'm launching some exclusive stories every other day, so if you are so enticed, feel free to check that out. But for now, it's time to get comfortable. Grab your flashlights and let the darkness take control. Several friends and I decided to go explore an abandoned mansion that belonged to a once-renowned World War II general that was seemingly abandoned in the 50s soon after his death. We arrived there at around 6 p.m. The mansion was huge and surrounded by forest and very tall grass on the road to the gates and the door. No one seemed to have visited the place in a really long time. We entered and began to explore the building. It was likely built in the late 1800s. It was huge, a whole labyrinth of rooms, ladders, terraces, and corridors. As we entered and passed from the small hall to the first big room, we heard this meowing from behind us, in a room from where we passed. It was a cat. Looked like he was about 3 to 4 years old, not that big, white with black spots, and looked very healthy. I noticed it immediately, as I volunteered for a homeless cat place for a while. The cat approached us without fear. I raised my hand and he instantly let me pet him. The fur was soft, clean, and in overall good condition, just a perfect cat. During our exploration of the labyrinth-like mansion, the cat was always hanging around with us. He had no fear and no particular curiosity towards humans, while readily letting everyone pet him. Very calm and confident. This was already strange enough for a cat who lived in an abandoned house, likely before his cat grandparents were born. When we were finally finished taking pictures, I grew concerned for the cat. This was the only thing nearby in the middle of nowhere, and it was completely abandoned. So I worried about this poor kitty. What if someone had dropped him off here and left him here for a while, and he needed a new home? And I decided that I would be taking him and find him a new home if I couldn't look after him myself. When I see where he is, I couldn't find him. He was nowhere to be seen, when half a minute ago he was running between our legs and meowing. But as soon as we were leaving the house, through that small entrance room, it was like he had vanished, and he didn't come out. I looked inside, called him, and there were no traces of our feline friend. I looked around a bit more, and finally made my way down to the basement, somewhere we hadn't particularly wanted to go. When I looked, I found something which disturbed me to my core. It was the remnants of a dead cat. Shape-wise and size-wise, it looked to be around the same as the one that had been following us around, and by the time I got back up the stairs and did one last check, he was nowhere to be found. I don't know if it was the ghost of the master's old cat, who still resides in the house, or just a coincidence. What do you think? I grew up in the country. I'm not talking like the middle of nowhere, but it was definitely a step down from the suburbs. Next to my house was a massive cornfield, but the houses on the other side and across the streets were somewhat close. But I also lived on a 7-acre lot, so it was somewhere between rural country and the suburbs. At the back of the property was a pretty big forest that eventually led into a nature trail, but before that there used to be a campground. This campground used to be a pretty popular place back in the day, long before we moved there, but it eventually closed abruptly. I don't know why exactly, but I've heard a lot of talk about there being issues with drugs. There were also rumors that people had been attacked there. No one that we knew in the area who was there at the time really knew for sure, but the fact remained that it closed, and they didn't tear it down. They just left this abandoned camp complete with cabins, a hall mess, and other buildings and a swimming pool. That in itself sounds creepy, and it was, but at the time this story took place I was very young at around 7, and probably quite naive given my age. Now this forest and abandoned camp wasn't part of our property. which ends just when you get to the tree line. However, at the time, the owner of that property and my dad were friendly with one another, and this guy said he didn't care if we went back there and even let my dad hunt there during deer season. So one evening when my mum was working nights, my dad took my sister, who was less than a year younger than I am, and myself back there to explore. It wasn't dark yet as it was summer, but it was getting close by the time we headed back. We explored a bit, though most of the buildings were locked and the pool was gross and there were a lot of spiders everywhere. I was getting eager to go back, and it was also pretty dusky by the time we explored the cabins. They were all unlocked, some didn't even have doors. We were just looking around. In hindsight, this sounds like the beginning of a horror movie, but I didn't know any better at the time, and my dad is basically fearless. While we were in one of the cabins, we heard voices outside it, and we peeked out of the windows and saw two 20-something-year-old guys. They looked rough and shifty, and they were talking loudly. It seemed like they were in some kind of rush, like they had to hurry up and do something back there, or like they were looking for something. Now, I have rarely seen my dad truly scared. If I ever have, or perhaps he's just good at hiding it, and while I wouldn't say he was exactly scared in this situation, I could tell he was uneasy, which was also unusual. He stood in the doorway of the cabin while my sister and I looked out the window. I was holding this loose brick I had picked up, and my dad told me to keep hold of it unless he told me to drop it, which for some reason sticks out to me. While watching through the window, I see one of the guys look towards the cabin and make eye contact with my dad, and they just stared at each other for a little bit. It seemed like forever at the time, but it probably wasn't that long. By this point, I was unsettled. The brick comment my dad made me realize this was a potentially dangerous situation. Then the guy whispered something to the other guy, who looked at my dad as well. They had a kind of silent standoff, and the two guys walked away into the trees, and once he couldn't see them anymore, he ushered us out. We headed back down to my house, but my dad seemed uneasy and kept looking behind us. We made it back with no problem, and nothing ever came of this encounter. My dad told us years later that neither of the people there that day were the owner, though I suppose they could have been there with permission. But he had a bad feeling, which I already know even back then, because he had asked us not to tell Mum. Nothing ever came of it, and maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation, but even so, it creeped us all out, especially given the tumultuous history of the abandoned camp. My dad never took us into the woods after that, at least not to the campground, though he did still hunt back there, and all these years later, I remain too afraid and uneasy to return. My friends and I loved to urban explore around our hometown of New Orleans while we were in high school and early in college. And by that I mean we'd just hop into the car and drive with no destination in mind, and end up somewhere interesting looking, then get out, walk around, and have a few stories, but this one stands out in my mind. One night, a friend of a friend took us to a secret beach, which required walking over a hill past these train tracks, even through a small patch of wood. It was a small sandy beach with overturned trees as benches. It had a view of the Mississippi River, and you could watch the large riverboats running up and down it. There were signs of people having been there at some point, trash scattered about, but we thought it was cool, and started a little fire pit out there and everything. He then told us about a ship graveyard that was a short hike through the woods. He showed us the way, and it was so neat. You trekked through this footpath, then climbed up this large dirt hill with giant pieces of metal jutting out to get back to the main attraction. It was basically the corpses of old ships in all manner of positions, as well as multitudes of old large shipping crates. It seemed maybe at one point it was some kind of docking station but had long since been abandoned. At the dead center of it all was a small building, Looked as if it had been an office or something. There was a large metal structure made of tubes near the huge overturned ship, like the ship had sank into the mud and the front end was sticking straight up into the sky. It was wild. We walked around and noticed some of the crates were open, but none of us went to look inside. There was also some graffiti on them, plus the building in the middle which read "The Rabbit's Hole" had a bunny tagged onto it. Maybe after half an hour of walking around, we climbed out of the ship's graveyard, walked back to the secret beach, and went home. A few months later, a tropical storm hit. The following weekend, I wanted to impress this girl I liked at the time and suggested our group of friends hang out that night back to the beach, since most of them hadn't seen it. We went back and it was almost totally reconstructed from the tropical storm. The log seats were moved about, the fire pit we had built was gone, and the path to the ship graveyard was a mess of debris and fallen tree branches. We hung out on the beach and I asked the group if they wanted to see the ship graveyard. We had to take a weird alternative route through the woods from the normal path because the main footpath was still flooded over. We get to the back and climb up the dirt hill. It was a trek, and it was sloppy and muddy, but the metal struts to climb in were sliding around, and it was much more difficult than before. We made it to the other side and everyone was astounded, and we walked around a bit. We found these giant fire extinguishers and they worked, and we sprayed them around and they were loud. We ended up walking over to the rabbit hole building, and one of my friends climbed to the roof to see if there was a way inside. Almost as soon as he reached the top, he quickly scaled down and whispered, "Someone is back here with us," and pointed towards the metal tube structure next to the overturned ship. And sure enough, there was someone tall and large rocking back and forth on the tube structure. Then we noticed there was a blanket or something hanging from the ship, as if he had climbed and was squatting there. The girl I was trying to impress was suddenly very unimpressed, and we made our way back to the dirt hill. We turned around and both the person and the blanket were gone. We proceeded to freak out and started to move faster. As we got to the top of the hill, we could see him walking past the rabbit hole. A few of us got cuts and scrapes trying to climb the metal structure in the mud, but we were in such a panic we didn't even notice until later. When we went the original way we came, away from the foot route, I don't think any of us had felt a walk took that long to get back. We only whispered to each other as we moved, and when we got back to the beach, we took off past the train tracks, got into my car and peeled off. To this day, I'm not sure who was there or why they were silently following us out, but it definitely was terrifying, and we never went back. This was almost 20 years ago, not far from a hotel that is well known to be haunted. A few friends and I decided to do a little urban exploring and ghost hunting one night. My friend and I had been ghost hunting for some time together, and these kids knew that, so we basically had a few tag-along tourists with us. Amazing how many people want to join once they know what you do every weekend. We go in and move a board that's already loose, not actually breaking it, just pulling it loose from the nails. We weren't trying to get charged if caught, so we always tried to be respectful as we could when making your way into an abandoned place. It was fairly uneventful. Some furniture was still in the building, but it was relatively clean aside from droppings everywhere. The bats mostly stayed in the attic, so we weren't disturbing them. That's also where they got in and out from, so we had made the decision prior to entry that we wouldn't mess with the attic. Nothing much happens, and two people make their way out and go back to the road. That left me and one other at the top of the stairs, and one girl who had never joined us for any hunts down at the floor level, just around the corner from the staircase in the living room. My buddy and I were both facing the same direction down the stairs, ready to make our way down. And we start to hear something from outside, which we later found out was the sheriff rolling our friends that had gone back to the cars. We also found out that the officers refused flat to get us out of the property or even walk up to the house, deciding instead to just wait for us to come out. I said something along the lines of, "You ready?" My buddy, "Yep." We both, almost shoulder to shoulder, at the top of the steps, took a deep breath in, loudly as it was dark, looked at each other with wide eyes, and stared at each other in the dark silently. For a few seconds the air felt as thick as paste, and we were both holding our breath. From downstairs the girl said, "What did you say?" "We're going outside," I responded. I could hear confusion in her voice. "Are you upstairs?" We were already moving pretty quickly down the stairs and didn't really reply. All three of us were out the hole pretty quickly one after another and got to our cars without really talking and were greeted by our other friends and a few cops. The cops admitted to thinking the building was haunted and asked us never to go back there ever because they wouldn't want to have to go in to look for us. The next day, the girl hit up my buddy and texted me saying that she wanted to meet up for a coffee to talk. Pretty standard, so I thought nothing of it. We met and she was wearing a really nice sundress that day. And she tells us that at the time we heard someone take a deep breath, she heard one of us, she thought, say, "What's that?" as if someone was just around the corner. But that wasn't why she wanted to meet us, not exactly. She'd gone home and had a nightmare. She was asleep in her bed and woke up to her bedroom door opening. She couldn't move. At her door in the dark house was a shadow that made no sense. Then she said it melted down to the floor and she lost sight of it, still unable to even move her head. She wanted to scream for her parents, but couldn't physically do it. Then a hand with 3 long fingers reached up past her head and grabbed her right leg hard and pulled her out of bed. She hit the floor hard and woke up. Sipping my coffee, I chuckled at her and jokingly said, "I don't think we've caused any nightmares taking people out before." Looking at my buddy, I said, "Looks like someone needs a little more time out before she gets used to it." This didn't please her. She slammed her hands on the table, alarming a few of the others around the coffee shop sitting near us, and I was like, "Easy, I'm only messing with you." She was pissed, and I realized she was really shaken. I then went from smartass to immediately feeling bad. Look, it was a nightmare. We had some weird experiences, and you took it to sleep with you. Then she stood up and pulled up the bottom of her dress, revealing the bruise on her leg that looked very similar to 3 long fingers. Tears in her eyes said, "Why me?" Thinking back, I remember how at that moment it broke my heart. More so that I didn't have an answer to why we didn't do a very good job of trying to comfort and reassure her. As can be expected, she never came back out with us after that. The biggest cork factory in Portugal opened in 1905 by the name Mundit & Sons. It was truly amazing. People ate, slept, and made their lives inside the factory headquarters, which employed a lot of women and was a sure sign of the changing times ahead. Then the work conditions started to go downhill. A lot of people lost body parts due to unsafe cork cutting with enormous razor-sharp blades that were everywhere. Some people even died. In the 50s, a medical center was built to help those in need near the factory. This alone led to an improvement in all ways. The work condition also began to increase. Later, in 1986, the factory's owner, Paula Mundet, also known as the Cork Queen, was brutally killed by her own lover, who cut her body to shreds. The gruesome murder, alongside the decline of the cork industry, led to her son, Joseph Mundet, closing its doors 2 years later in 1988. In the 90s, the place was heavily guarded by armed security, but they began speaking on a werewolf in the vaulted area, and by the 2000s, the night shift positions were abandoned. Only video cameras registered the nocturnal events, and guards would work there from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. at best. This alone gave room to a ton of teens trying to go there and explore the abandoned place, as it was starting to become famous in its own right. Friends of mine actually found money, guns, and a lot of other valuable items they sold later. With this, they started to get comfortable and taking pics there, and by 2005 some pictures were disturbing. In one of them you can see a distorted girl's face in the glass's reflection. Bear in mind these were street kids and they had no clue what was happening. They began experiencing some events, seeing apparitions and hearing voices by the vault area. They later spoke with elderly folk from town who had worked there, which most of them had lacked fingers on their hands. One day some years later, police entered to arrest them, gun in hand. I suppose they stopped going there. But all were not arrested, but some had to spend the night there, under some staircase or old hidden machinery. Now this is my account. By 2015 I was becoming friends with one of the boys that had entered the factory. One night I told him I wished to go, but now I wish I hadn't. We entered through some construction work path. I remember I got spooked when I entered the main gate by the side as it was closed shut, of course. My brother was there too. He's always loved exploring these places and that calmed me. We were just 3 dudes entering a giant compound with a soap camera to capture evidence of something. I was not thinking about ghosts much, more about the factory stopped in time. The street looked like it was from a Hollywood scenery set from the 50s. Our friend had some old keys which I assume he took from the vault. Some still opened locks. As we entered a few buildings, we went further into the darkness and started to listen to the sound of working machines. At the same time, my brother snapped a pic, and there is a big mist forming around where the sound was coming from. We moved on, capturing mist and colourful orbs, listening to the machines whirring. That's when we saw someone looking out the window at us and we ran. Then we listened to the footsteps approaching, all of us getting ready for the police, but they stopped right at the door and there was no one there. We decided to hang out there a while longer, and then we saw through the window where the man was standing had no floor. It was impossible for someone to go there at all. We ran out there. It was starting to be too much, and we came back 2 days later, just my brother and I. Infrared sensors gave some reading through the roof and shuttered down as we saw 2 giant orbs with our bare eyes. We went back some days later with our friend group to go to the red zone, which is supposedly where the worst happened. It was stagnated, signed papers from the 1980s, machines rustling, roof falling, all in complete darkness as we explored the basements. Parts were falling apart from the roof and bats were flying around, but we stood our ground and not much happened that night. Not much we noticed anyway. I was baffled by all that. It was strange to notice how the other boys that went there in the early 2000s were now afraid of entering. We went back a few times, with more than 10 people expecting some minor thing, but we never had the courage to stay long. Nowadays it's being demolished. It's sad, but needed. The place was falling apart, and one night when we were there, we noticed the roof had collapsed exactly where we had been standing before. We weren't allowed to go there anyway, and a homeless man had died recently there, so it was best to avoid it. In high school in Mesa, Arizona, there was a mansion that was rumored to be haunted. It was built in the back of a neighborhood surrounded by citrus trees with fully paved roads, but not a single other house built. I'd gone there in big groups of 20+ people, and there was always an eerie feeling, but nothing specific happened, although a girl did break her arm there once, but that's a different story. One night we were bored and decided to go with only 6 of us. The house was in the middle of a giant island in the middle of a cul-de-sac, so we parked in the back to hide our car. We walked through the citrus trees towards the house and soon heard rustling in the trees behind us. I kept turning around to see if someone was following us and finally saw a few javelinas. They aren't very aggressive, but they definitely spooked us. So we get close to the house and there's a light on inside. We've never seen a light on. So 4 of the 6 refused to get any closer, but 2 sneaked up to look into the window. The first window we looked in, the lights were off, but light was spilling from the next room over, so we snuck to the next window and peeked in. The lights were off in this room too, but light was now spilling from the room we had just looked at. We ended up circling the house and could not find the origin of the light or evidence of anything inside. We talked to the others about going into the backyard and sitting by the pool to share ghost stories. After a few stories on the other side of the pool, there was a 1950s-style radio. When we had been there in larger groups, we would always try to turn it on but never could. In the middle of my friend's story, the radio turned on to static. We all turned to look at the radio for 10 seconds or so before it shut off again. By this time we were seriously spooked and decided to leave. As we walked through the backyard to the citrus trees, we walked up to the racquetball court, which was halfway buried in the ground, and there were stairs up to the roof, which was about 8 feet off the ground. We walked up and looked over the orange grove to see our car on the other side. One of my friends turned to look at the house and suddenly froze. "Do not turn around." Of course, we all turned around to face the house and couldn't see anything. "What?" I asked. "Look in the house." On the first floor facing the pool were 2 glass French doors, and standing inside was the dark silhouette of a man staring. He didn't move, he just stood there watching. We all counted to 5 and jumped off the roof and ran through the orange trees to our car. To this day, I have no idea what was inside that door. The streets on the Lower East Side of New York City in the early 80s were usually a dream for your typical heroin addict. A simple walk from, say, Avenue B to 2nd to 3rd would usually permit you to pass at least 4 or 5 drug dealers or spot where you could buy heroin or cocaine. But this night was different. My friend Mario and I were going out to cop some dope at around 9:30. The police presence was heavy and things were generally shut down. As you walked those streets, you encountered other junkies from all classes and backgrounds, all caught up in the heat of finding the needed fix. We decided to check out The Original. This was a spot in a lot which was once a building but had been demolished, and there was only rubble surrounded by huge piles of debris. The way this spot worked was in the dead of night you stumbled into this hellhole and waited for someone to tell you to line up. That meant service was coming, insofar as some nasty junkie didn't try and rob you or beat you as you waited in the darkness. This night you could feel it in the air, how palpable the tension grabbed you by the belly. There must have been 25 people all there to cop the tout, who announced the arrival of the dealer and directed people. He kept disappearing, looking nervously over his shoulder. Then he disappeared, and we all didn't know what would come next. Several times we heard the screaming, "Baondo." That meant police. It meant scram. We kept running out of the lot and congregating back after 10 minutes. The crowd grew to about 40. Unlike other establishments, which were often holes in the walls of abandoned buildings, Originals just had a wall that everyone lined up against, like a firing squad. The dealer or dealers would run down and start serving both ends of the line if you were lucky. Sometimes only one would come and offer express service for a fee. Pay up $5 and you get stoned sooner. That night was moonless, and this was becoming a daunting project. Finally, all of us mulling around, we heard line up. People jostled one another to form a line, and there we all were. Nothing. No one was coming. The most hopeful waited anyway. Suddenly I heard a loud boom, and I turned in the direction of the sound and saw a man waving a pistol with chrome plate reflecting the single high crime lamp that was maybe 20 yards away. He shot again. He ran down the pile of debris followed by his assistant and told everyone to face the wall. He and his helper then started to rob everyone stuck there. He was actually a bad cop from the 8th precinct, as I found out later. Like a cop, each person in line was asked for their wallet and sometimes for their ID. Then he grabbed the wallet and pulled out the cash. Now Mario had my money. He was going to be the buyer that night. So when they got to me, I told him I didn't have the money, that my partner had it down the line. And he raised his pistol like he was going to smack me with it. But he didn't. Suddenly, again, he fired a shot into the ceiling and yelled for everyone to get out fast. To my right, a large pile of debris and garbage about 10 feet high was my closest exit point. I scrambled onto it hoping to get out, yet I couldn't quite do that. I was caught hanging by my feet and I knew that Mario had gotten away before the pigs got everyone, so there was still hope, but damn, I couldn't get over this. One more time a pistol discharged from behind me and zip! I was up and over the obstacle in a hot second. I checked myself for bullet holes and went down the street looking for Mario. We were not to be deterred. There was a spot on 3rd Street called Executive. Executive's building had been mostly gutted by fires, and the entrance had a tout and we went in. There was no electricity anymore, but there were candles lit on the dilapidated stairs leading to our hopes. We went up one flight, then another, where everything smelled of char. Finally, another set of stairs. It was so dark except for a few candles every 15 feet or so. Now, here was the dealer. He asked how many, but before he could finish, we again heard the cry of alarm from below, and he scuttled into darkness. There were maybe 15 buyers up there with me and Mario. What they did intimidate me to this day. In the near pitch-black darkness, people moved through the hole of fallen wall onto wooded or concrete beams that connected the buildings. These beams were about 1 foot wide, maybe 14 inches, and all in darkness. Mario took this route, and I saw people rushing it with their arms extended across the girders, but it wasn't for me. I started to search for a hiding place. As I did, I could hear the cops laughing as they discovered people, and also heard screams of pain and an occasional loud thwack. I saw in the shambles of a room a bathtub filled with plaster, and decided I was going to have a plaster bath. I tried to cover myself in the tub so no one would see me, but was not so successful. As the cops hit the 4th floor, I heard very distinctly a jovial voice saying, "Well, hello there." I was petrified. They told me to get up, so I did. They seemed to be in a good mood. The 2 of them asked me some questions and wanted to look at my ID. I was shaking, expecting blows, but they told me to just go down to where I'd came from, and I happily obliged. I went home, Mario had my money, and I prepared for a night of withdrawal symptoms. Luckily, Mario was a friend and he showed up with a few bags of dope later. That was one hellish night. In August of 2018, I visited the famously haunted Bodmin jail with my family, aged 16. It wasn't until 3 years later, after a period of severe depression and anxiety, that my brain allowed me to start putting pieces together, and I believe the visit to this jail left me with something. At age 16, I wasn't a solid believer in the paranormal. I was into paranormal shows, watched all the trashy ghost hunting shows out there, and had a large collection of books on the subject, but I'd never experienced anything with my own senses that I could confidently describe as paranormal. I was completely open to it, but I'd never experienced it myself. I thankfully also had never experienced mental health issues. I'd made it through school confident, grounded, and pretty comfortable with myself, and looking forward to the future. Fast forward to my family holiday in Cornwall 2018, and we decided to visit the Bodmin jail, having seen photos online of the incredible abandoned wings of the prison, overgrown with ivy and slowly decaying behind the layer of moss. We'd visited many similar sites over the years, and although prisons have an inherently spooky vibe to them, something about Bodmin felt immediately different to me. I remember feeling as though I could easily have maxed out a heart rate monitor as we walked through the gates into the courtyard. My memory of the building and our tour around it is a little fragmented since it took place 5 years ago. I first recall descending narrow stairs with a cast iron handrail into a basement section of the building. Once in the lower levels, I felt a sudden wave of complete emotional overload. It felt as though I could physically feel all of the emotions of the building. The air felt like it was squeezing my stomach, and I completely disassociated from my surroundings. It's one of the worst sensations I felt to this day. I described it to my girlfriend, like the feeling you get in a nightmare, where not just events or places are bad, but your entire being is bad. You're existing on a plane of reality constructed from pain and fear. Something I felt specifically in the basement area is the sense that things happen there which are not known about, as if all the people who suffered were screaming out that the crimes were committed against them in the lower levels of the building which were never discovered. Forms of abuse or punishment which were far more extreme and perverse than what is commonly acknowledged about prisons of the era. Other parts of the jail felt terrible still, but none as hopeless and dark as the lower levels. The only other area which felt comparable to the basement was an area located at the entrance to the naval wing of the jail. I vaguely remember an entrance to a shaft of some kind, possibly a lift or chimney, which had a very foreboding aura to it. Interestingly, I felt complete disconnection from the execution pit on display there. On paper, this should be a more sinister part of the tour, but I remember feeling far less suffocated there, as if a part of my subconscious recognized the area as wrong. A voice in a deep part of my brain was telling me, "Wait, this isn't how it looked. I've never experienced a feeling like that." In the months following, I began college, and not long after my first term, I began experiencing things I'd never felt before. Moments where I would again feel the same sense of darkness and panic that I did in the basement of Bodmin jail. Days where it felt as though my brain was trapped somewhere but my body was free. I remember occasions when I cried out of the blue for no reason. Nothing was happening in my life which would trigger these reactions. My life was going well by all accounts, although it did not stay this way for the coming years. By the following winter, I had decided to see a therapist. I was struggling in so many areas of my mental health. Most interestingly, that I would panic in a space where I was shut in. Classrooms with closed doors, buses, rooms with no clear exit. A therapist even told me once that my symptoms reflected those of someone struggling with PTSD, and explicitly listed an example of someone who had previously been incarcerated. Somehow I still didn't connect the dots. The visit to the jail had not crossed my mind in a very long time. During my recovery from this period of depression, I developed an interest in meditation and spirituality. Meditation was without a doubt one of the most powerful tools to my recovery, and I inevitably found myself researching different types of meditation practices. One day I decided to follow a guided meditation track designed to help you recall images from past lives. While I never came to any meaningful conclusion about past lives, I did encounter several very vivid images while doing the meditation, which I drew on scrap paper immediately afterwards. One image, a clock tower, seemed oddly familiar. At some point that day, it dawned on me that the clock tower was in fact the clock tower located not far from Bodmin jail, near a set of roundabouts in the village. All the memories of the jail, the visit, and the sensation I felt there came back to me in a flood, and I felt completely engulfed, the same way I felt when I was in the basement of the jail. I spent time researching it, and discovered after a while that the clock tower stands where the original town gallows were located, before gallows were constructed inside the prison walls. It took me a good while to reach the conclusion that the visit to the jail may have been the trigger for all the emotional turmoil I went through. The random intense feelings I continued to encounter occasionally out of the blue, anger, fear, hopelessness, being trapped, feeling betrayed, may not be as random as I'd previously thought. I think I'm still in the slow process of accepting that I didn't leave from that jail alone. Something came with me, be it the memories and feelings of another who suffered there, or my own memories from a previous lifetime. Either way, my life has been different ever since. Although mentally I made a good recovery despite 2 years of hell, I've never felt the same. Like sometimes I'll be enjoying a good day, and something just materializes inside me, and I'm right back on those basement levels, feeling trapped, scared, angry, cold, and sick. and then it's gone just as quickly as it's come. I've seen other posts on Reddit about this place, and I'm hoping to hear some other stories about it. If you've visited this location or have any kind of experience with attachment or past life memories, I'd love to hear your thoughts or your stories. Thank you for your time. 10 years ago, a couple was arrested for hoarding animals, mostly dogs. The authorities entered their large home to find over 100 sick and emaciated dogs with dead ones strewn about and stacked in the sinks and bathtubs. The floors were soaked in urine, and the police had to wear respirators and hazmat suits to enter. The house was immediately condemned and was left as is. I grew up around the area and had heard about the story. However, I knew only what the news article stated. The husband was a doctor, the wife was his receptionist, and over 100 dogs were rescued, while others were deceased inside the home. The condition of the house was poor. There were no pictures of the couple or a follow-up of the arrest. I never thought I'd come to know as much as I do now. I enjoy exploring abandoned buildings, particularly ones with dark history. However, I'm also an animal lover. I wasn't sure if I wanted to enter this house, because I was unsure if the deceased animals' corpses would be left rotting inside. 9 years after the incident occurred, I finally decided I was going to explore it. I've been in places where horrible things have happened, but I'll admit that I've never been as disturbed as I was in this mansion. Upon entering the area, the first thing I noticed was how large the property was. I knew that it was over 40 acres. The mansion itself was a decent size too, but the outside was nothing impressive. It was a drab brown color, with shingles falling off and boards over every window. In the distance, I could see a life-sized dollhouse, much fancier than the house standing before me. Must have had kids, I told myself. Luckily for me, the front door stood wide open. I walked in, crunching some glass as I stepped, and as my eyes adjusted, I realized that the room before me was very colorful. The floors were cluttered, and it was obvious that the house had had its fair share of vandals. The walls were bizarre colors, sometimes mixed with old floral wallpaper. There was a faint urine smell, but otherwise no sign of dogs. All the family's possessions were left, thrown around no doubt, but the vandals hadn't seemed to have taken much. Interestingly, the power was still on. I found a lamp switched on, tossed onto the floor. The wife had a large amount of clothes, mostly with the tags attached. They seemed to have at least one daughter, whose many rooms were filled with every toy imaginable. I noticed a trend, though. The daughter really liked animals. I eventually came across boxes of family pictures, and I sat down and looked at every single one. It took a long time, but I was intrigued. The pictures told a very different story to the little I knew of these people. They threw extravagant parties at their house, spoiled their daughter, and always looked presentable. There were many pictures of the house aside from the daughter's room. It was barely recognizable. The walls were mostly white and the rooms were clean. They held many events there, from costume and birthday parties to recitals and charity dinners. They also had pictures of animals: dogs, cats, birds, horses, and snakes. They took their dogs everywhere, it seemed, even to churches and schools. There were never pictures of more than 5 dogs, and during that time they looked well fed. However, some of the animal pictures were definitely questionable. One had a dog sitting on a urine-soaked chair, while another showed their daughter holding up a Yorkie who had obviously just given birth. The pictures raised more questions than answers. I was quite surprised by it all, because this was not how I imagined animal hoarders. I imagined them to be reclusive, lonely, and unclean, not a wealthy family of social partygoers. At this point, you may be thinking that I'm the creepy one, looking through all the stuff of a random family and wishing I could learn everything about them. And you're probably right, but I was becoming obsessed. Were they already hoarding when the pictures were taken? Did they hide the hoarding from their daughter or convince her it was normal? What about the dead dogs stacked in the sinks and tubs? Was it only one spouse that was responsible for it? If so, why didn't the other do something? These questions and 100 more raced through my head, and I was determined to find some answers. I learnt later that the pictures were taken 5 to 10 years before they were arrested. Whether or not they had hundreds of dogs already remains unclear. Their daughter was 17 at the time of the arrest. She had just started college and was attending boarding school before that. Though I won't be so quick to call her innocent, I had imagined she had to be conditioned to believe there was nothing wrong with the inhumane, despicable torture of these animals. This certainly seemed to be the case when I messaged her through social media. I was dying to get some answers and figured it couldn't hurt to try. I messaged her in a respectful way, though perhaps I was slightly manipulative. I had already done all the research I could by that point, and saw the others who had also found her weren't very kind. So I approached her carefully, being as honest as possible without revealing how much I knew. She took up better than expected, although she was guarded and said that she doesn't like to think about that weird time in her life. What she said, and what was left unsaid, gave me a few answers. It's quite obvious to this day that she doesn't think it was a big deal. She was way more concerned about how her parents' arrests made her look. She stated that the whole situation was blown out of proportion. She said at the time she hated her parents for dragging her into something that she had nothing to do with, and while it's true that she was away at college, I also found old messages directly after the incident of her saying she was mad because her pets were taken away. In our conversations, she never showed remorse for the animals or admitted there was any wrongdoing. She never said it was a bad situation and always described it as odd or weird. The only sorrow she felt was for herself, as she claims that her parents are great people and that her mother has received mental help. Not trying to judge here, it's impossible to know what it's like not being in her shoes, but to think that starving dogs to death, eating each other and living in their own filth is okay? But then again, I wasn't raised by dog hoarders. Now I'm weeks into this obsession and I finally have some answers, but they just raise more questions. The wife pleaded guilty to 1 count of aggravated cruelty to animals. She was sentenced 840 hours of community service in lieu of 6 months of jail and 5 years probation with alcohol and narcotics conditions. I took interest in the probation conditions, and upon reviewing the law in this state, it seems the judge only ordered when the crime is possibly related to substance abuse. So what was she abusing? Another thing to note about the wife is in the pictures this woman was dressed very neatly almost all the time. She seemed quite happy in most of the pictures and was usually smiling. According to journalists, she showed up to the court disheveled, in pajamas with 2 different shoes on. She refused to address the judge, and he ordered her to get a mental evaluation. The daughter said that they did indeed receive mental help, and I specifically asked about her mother because I had already learnt that she was the one charged. However, my theory is that she was deemed mentally fit. In this state, animal cruelty is already overlooked, and judges are way too lenient. So I personally find it unlikely that she was found to be mentally ill and still charged with aggravated cruelty to animals. But I could be wrong. On the other hand, her husband pled guilty to disorderly conduct and received a $200 fine. He also still practices medicine. Something about his court appearance stuck out to me as well. When the judge asked if he had a lawyer, he said no, and that he didn't know how to get one. He ended up with a public defender, a rich doctor who owns properties worth millions and can't hire a lawyer? Strange. This all leaves my mind open to many more questions and theories. If he's competent enough as a doctor, shouldn't he be to blame as well? In fact, if the wife was found mentally ill, couldn't he even be more at fault that she was? I'm doubting the possibility that he was found to be mentally unfit because he continues to practice, but I don't have much faith in our system. Now, it was well over a month since I visited the house, and I still yearned for answers. Unsure of how else to proceed, I only saw one way forward. My plan was simple, but I assumed it was going to be fruitless. I decided to go visit the doctor in person. I didn't have insurance and assumed they wouldn't actually take me as he's a specialist. I figured I'd walk in and ask about it and just get turned down or told it's hundreds of dollars, but at least maybe I'd get a glimpse of them. The online reviews about him were horrible. Dirty office, condescending tone, made fun of their affliction, receptionist was rude. It seemed neither had showered in months. These were all common complaints. A few days later, I'm standing in front of the building. It looks exactly like all the other apartments surrounding it, with no indication it's a doctor's office. I think about how suspicious it would be to barge in there at random. I'm anxious, but my curiosity pushes me through the door, and I enter the dark and dingy hallway. I look up and my heart lurches. It's her, the wife, much older now, sitting behind a cluttered desk at the end of the hallway, wearing an odd array of clothing, pajama pants, a neat top, Converse shoes with bows on them, with disheveled hair, her face worn with age. Though she turned to look in my direction, her eyes didn't meet mine. I began approaching, rambling on about wanting to make an appointment, when she interrupts. "Would you like to see the doctor?" I stand in a shocked silence for a moment, her voice completely emotionless, monotone. You know how people talk in movies when they've had lobotomies? Yeah, dead inside. I stutter, a yes, and she leads me inside the room. It's oddly colored with old floral wallpaper. This time I'm able to finish my sentence and I tell her I don't have insurance. She says it's fine, that it's $50. Let me state that by seeking a specialist without an appointment or insurance, here a $50 fee is highly unusual. I pay, fill in the forms she gives me, and before long, she says I can see the doctor. I wait for 20 minutes in complete silence, while the doctor presumably stares at the wall. Finally, he enters. His outfit is bizarre, wearing a stained mustard yellow hoodie with forest green sweatpants, black socks pulled up over the bottom of the pants, and he's wearing Converse sneakers like his wife. He has a lab coat over all of this, and my first impression is that he's a complete moron. He spends no time asking me about my affliction, which I basically made up, and instead starts asking me personal questions. He asks where I live, where I work, and I tell him that I work with animals, and ironically we talk about them for a while. I work mostly with snakes, so his questions are about them at first. He thinks they're disgusting, and so is their food. Then we move on to hawks. He talks about how he used to have them in his old house. I casually ask him where that was. It was the first time I saw emotion reach his eyes. Panic. He quickly lies and moves on. When the conversation was over, I watched him go out of his way to avoid interacting with his wife multiple times, and the appointment was finished. I'd like to add a few things. I believe the animal hoarders were recently classified as its own mental disorder. Animal hoarders typically think they're doing a good thing, even when they're obviously not. They seem to live in a state of mental denial, convincing themselves that they're doing the best they can for them. It's common for them to hoard the bodies too. They often forego their own comfort, a clean house space, and sometimes even electricity to provide for the animals. Clearly both of them had something wrong with them. The husband was an imbecile, and he was either on drugs, drunk, or had a condition. I'm not sure who would ever go to him for actual health issues. The wife's emotionless demeanor is fascinating and also quite sad, and probably bothered me the most out of everything. I just wondered if, beside the meds, what else triggered everything? The hoarding, the loss of emotions, maybe even the paintings on all the walls. As the follow-up appointment approached, I did manage to strike a conversation with the daughter once more, where a few things were made clear. The wife was living a relatively normal social life until disaster struck. Her brother OD'd and died. Within 2 months of that, both her healthy parents died too. They died of heartbreak, apparently. The woman had lost her entire family in a very short period of time, and she began hoarding animals to fill the void. I'm guessing the dogs were never fixed as they kept having puppies. It seems this kind of emotional trauma is common in animal hoarders. But the daughter still claimed it was blown out of proportion, that she was disgusted and stayed out of the situation as much as possible, and that she was angry and didn't talk to them for a while after their arrests. However, that seemed to be more from embarrassment than anything, and she developed a drug habit due to the stress of the incident, but has since found her way of coping. That said, the doctor is the one I put the blame on most. He watched idly as his wife had a complete breakdown for years, hoarding animals, possession, carcasses, making their house unlivable, driving their daughter away, and probably much more. The daughter claimed he was too supportive and he let her be as crazy as she wanted to be. The wife was never put on any medication but did go through extensive talk therapy. She's very against medication due to her brother's OD. Apparently she's doing as well as she can be and has overcome many issues. I think that pretty much sums everything up, everything we're gonna know in any case. Hey guys, it's Mort here and thank you so much for listening. I do hope you enjoyed tonight's stories. If of course you did, let me know down below. And would you like to go urban exploring yourself? I personally would, but don't have the courage to do so. But it does sound fun. And, you know, a little bit illegal, so Anyway, that aside, a huge thanks to all my members and patrons whose names can be seen on screen. If you would like to join their ranks with your name at the end of the video and some really cool perks, links in the description. But for now, that's it from me. Stay awesome, more content on screen, and I'll see you in the next one.